Privilege to open this launch meeting on behalf of the Richard Boyd Barrett campaign. I've known Richard for 10-15 years. He's
20, I'm afraid, Kieran.
20. The years slip by. He's a fantastically hard worker and somebody I think that would be a tremendous representative here. Now, in terms of an opening speech, you normally do a sort of wind up, get the atmosphere going and so on, but I've been given the task of talking about economics, so my apologies from the beginning of that. But let's start with a question that anybody who wants to bring about change in this country is asked, which is, what are we going to do about the 19 billion deficit? You're talking very nice, but what are we going to do about the 19 billion deficit? And first of all, it's a bit of a trick question in two ways, right? Because first of all, it assumes that everything is going fine, but we're just losing a bit of money. But the question is, why are we losing the money? Why are taxes falling? Why are so many people out of work? Why are the people who have money not investing? Why has the economy seized up? You're supposed to ignore all that and just deal with, well, where are you going to get to 19 billion? It's also a trick question in the sense that, who's this we? It's always saying we're all in it together, we're all going to give a dig out, and then we're going to get to 19 billion. But that's not been the story of the last two and a half years, horrendous years. The story of the last 2.5 years is that a wealthy elite, a very highly organised wealthy elite, have pushed policies of making low and middle income people pay for the crisis while they effectively get off scot-free. And you look at some of the crudeness behind it. I mean, how many know that, for example, one of the senior advisors that framed the last budget was a former director of Allied Irish Bank? Jim O'Leary, economist in Maynooth, used to be a non-executive of AIB and then turns up as an economist advising on framing the budget. How many of you know, for example, that the advice that we, the taxpayer, paid 9 million to bring about this wonderful scheme called the Bank Guarantee Scheme, that advice came from Arthur Cox, who was also working for, guess who? Bank of Ireland. How many know, for example, the NAMA scheme? The NAMA scheme devised by an economist called Peter Bacon, who also, coincidentally, used to be a director for Ballymore Properties, one of the major building companies, and coincidentally, one of the major donors to Lord Liam Lucan. This is the sort of country we live in. It's a country where a tiny elite have pushed policies to save their own skin and make the majority pay up. So when we offer an alternative, well, we're not promising pie in the sky, and we're not saying it's going to be jammed tomorrow. We're simply saying we're going to set out to reverse that strategy. And specifically, we want to reverse the cuts in social welfare. We want to reverse the universal social charge, which has really hit working people in the last period. And we want to have a public works programme. Now, in many ways, it's not very complicated. Because let's take, for example, the cuts in social welfare. The government has saved, as they put it, 800 million in cuts in social welfare. But this week, the government has paid 750 million to the bondholders of Anglo-Irish Bank. How do you stop cuts in social welfare? Stop paying the bondholders in Anglo-Irish Bank. I mean, it's not tremendously complicated. The universal social charge, that is going to save the country 440 million. Can we think of other ways of saving 440 million? Well, I think I can. Let's have, for example, a tax of 48% on incomes. Once you go over 100,000, you pay 48% on tax. That will raise about 350 million or so. So for any of the cuts, you can always think of an alternative, provided you start by asking the question, not how do we pay, how do we all pay, but who is going to pay? And the fact in recent years, it's middle and low income people that actually are paying at the moment. Now, I just want to very quickly propose 4 main mechanisms by which, in very, very general terms, we can deal with this question of the how do you pay for the deficit. First, we have to stop bailing out banks. I mean, this is so obvious. Actually, it's become even more obvious today. There's a very interesting story in the Irish Independent. We, the people, have put 60 billion, roughly 60 billion, into the banks at the moment. The Irish Independent reveals today that out the other end of the banks has gone 110 billion. There's a run on Irish banks going on at the moment. quiet run on banks. 18 billion of that has come from wealthy Irish people, have begun moving their money out. So what we're doing is we're filling a leaking bucket. We're putting money in, but out goes the other end, money, if you like, being moved out of Ireland, because people do not, the rich people, or people who have a lot of money, do not believe that the strategy the government is pursuing is actually sustainable. So the idea that you can actually keep on paying off bondholders, that has to end. So that's our very, very first proposal. You stop paying off bondholders and you look after the people of this country instead. The second main mechanism for dealing with this is to shift the burden of the adjustment onto a wealthy elite who, as I said, have dominated policies up to now. How might that happen? Well, let's take, for example, a not such a radical country like France. One of the things that France has is a wealth levy. In other words, if you have assets of over €1 million, barring your house and so on, if you have assets of over €1 million, you should pay a wealth levy of maybe 1% or 2%. This is normal stuff in other countries. In Ireland, however, the only people who get to pay levies are PAYE workers, public pension levies or PAYE workers in general. Why can't we have a wealth levy? Why can't we have a third rate of tax on incomes over 100,000? These are not radical ideas. They're simple ideas. Ireland, I just discovered recently, is one of the main centres for financial speculation in Europe. About 10% of all hedge funds, speculation in bonds and so on, goes to the Irish Financial Services Centre. Now, the right-wing Prime Minister of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, has proposed a tiny, tiny little tax on financial transactions of half of 1%. A half of 1% on financial transactions in Ireland will save the need to hit PAYE workers continually. This is our second proposal. You can actually shift the tax burden onto those who can afford it. Thirdly, we are for cutting some waste. We're for cutting waste in the public sector, but not the sort of waste that people like Brian Lenihan and Brian Cowan continually hit on. I'm for cutting. I work in UCD. I don't mind saying this. I work at UCD. The top management of UCD pay themselves, I think it's now, they've had a little bit of a reduction. It's about €220,000 a year. I don't think they should be paid that for working in university. I mean, I'm sorry, but I tell them to their face as well. I don't think they should be paid that for working in university. I don't think people should be paid in the public sector over 150,000. I don't think the head of the HSE, Cathal McGee, should be paid more than the US president. I'm sorry, I just don't think this is right. So there's a whole host of measures we can take. I mean, I look at my own college and I find this glossy PR stuff. Continually, when you see something very glossy, you know there's very little inside it, right? Continual glossy PR stuff. Cut out this sort of funding. I worry about the fact in my university we have IBM consultants who are essentially not disorganising us in many ways. I'm sorry, but you don't need external consultants brought in continually into the public sector. So all of these are forms of waste we can do without, and some of it you may not all agree with, but I think you can look at, if you like, having a more efficient public sector, not by attacking the people who work in it, but often by attacking the needless waste. And very lastly, I think there's a bigger problem in Ireland. I just want to restate it, then maybe throw it out. You see, I think that there is a section of the Irish population that has given up on this country. There's a very doomsday scenario for Ireland. I mean, I visited Latvia and Lithuania there over summer. A country where very underpopulated, vast emigration, the youth have left, a small elite hanging on, but really not particularly caring about the country. That is a possible scenario for Ireland. We're now having levels of immigration that are similar to the 80s. And I think some people think that's what's going to happen in this country. And that elite in Ireland have given up confidence in this country. And you can see it by the fact they are not investing. The investment in industry in Ireland has fallen by about 70% in the last number of years. Wealth is flying out of the country. And I think that control of the wealth and resources of Ireland by a tiny elite who do not have confidence in its people is a problem. And we're going to have to tackle that, and I believe the United Left Alliance give a start in helping to tackle that big problem. Thank you very much.